Hello everyone! Judith is a deck I've been playing off and on for a couple years now. For a while, she was pretty janky, but today, I can't wait to finally be talking about her. Because oh my, have things been looking up and up for this card with no signs of stopping. Judith is a 3-mana 2/2 with an attack boosting Lord effect and a triggered ability that deals 1 damage to any target whenever a non-token creature you control dies. Reading this card may first induce apathy, but hold out hope. Things are about to get really interesting. On the surface, it may appear that this 1 damage ping is worse for multiplayer when compared to other options like Elastil Core, Sadistic Pilgrim, or Garna, Bloodfist of Keld. But it's not worse. It just has a different application. You see, Judith doesn't just deal damage to players. This makes her the only aristocrat commander that gets to repeatedly gun down creatures with death touch pings. This is far from the only thing that makes Judith interesting, but before I go on about all that, I need to first discuss how to circumvent Judith's only real downside, the fact that she only cares about non-token creatures dying. This restriction is not to be taken lightly, since token producers make for excellent sack fodder without having to go down on actual cards. This being said, Black has no shortage of non-token creatures that are great to sacrifice. That brings us to a card that has me excited for Judith's future, 9 Lives Familiar. Previewed at MagicCon Amsterdam, this card is upcoming in November's Magic Foundation set. It doesn't take long to see why this card is incredible for Judith. For 3 mana, you get 9 non-token sacrifices. That is undeniably amazing. But it still might have a rival for best sacrificial creature in the deck, if you can believe it. I'm of course referring to OTJ's Forsaken Miner. You see, Judith commits crimes with her trigger. While you need to invest a mana each time you sacrifice Forsaken Miner, you can do so multiple times per turn, unlike the cat. This card is so synergistic with Judith that I had to cut Phyrexian Altar from the list to stop easily winning on turn 5. Since we're on the topic of crimes, I'd be remiss not to mention Magda the Horde Master, who also makes an appearance here. She produces an incredible amount of mana with Judith and other crime enablers in the deck. To be fair, she makes much less mana than Mahadi, but no one can hold a candle to the amount of mana that guy makes. Anyway, the synergy doesn't stop at just crime and cats. Another remedy to Judith's non-token restriction are the cards Living Death, Chthonian Nightmare, and Prowling Geistcatcher. With Chthonian Nightmare being a new card, you can't quite trust the data on it. But the almost 3-year-old Prowling Geistcatcher being only in 7 Judith decks according to the database is unforgivable. Everyone knows about Living Death synergy with sacrifice outlets that allows you to freely kill your board at least once without worry. With the Geistcatcher, it's the same idea. Since it stores the dying creatures in exile for when it leaves the battlefield, it lets you sacrifice your entire board in the optimal order before popping the Geistcatcher to return all of your victims into play guilt-free. As for Chthonian Nightmare, the most expensive creatures in the deck are 4 mana, so it can return most of them with no issue and the rest with very, very little work. In this deck, Chthonian Nightmare actually functions better than the banned card it's referencing, Recurring Nightmare. You know, the card's so good we say recursion in its honor even to this day. A bonus for this low curve that I refuse not to at least mention is the fact that Lively Dirge becomes a mono black Green Sun Zenith, allowing you to put any creature in the list directly into play, in addition to its use as a piece of recursion. Most of this video so far is just talking about how to efficiently build a deck around her non-token requirement. There's far more to Judith than death touch pings, crime, and jumping through deck building hoops. For instance, how many of you noticed Judith is a Shaman? Probably not many if EDH Rec is to be believed. But it's important because this deck runs Harmonic Prodigy to double up the pings from Judith. This is already great, but there are a slew of other cards that can make incredible use of this doubling. First, there are creatures the deck runs as sack fodder that replace themselves with card draw. Novice Occultist, and the 3 Augurs, Clattering, Undead, and Corpse. Double the card draw from these is great, of course, but it's far from the only synergy the Prodigy has. For example, Plague Crafter is a Shaman. When doubled, he forces each player to sacrifice 2 creatures, which can be an immense tempo disruption to opponents, especially when you break that parity of the sacrifice with cards like Mahadi, Mayhem Devil, or Blood Artist. The penultimate synergy in terms of power is Vindictive Lich. This card is very funny alone, but just like a joke, it's less funny for everyone else the second time around. You get to mix and match the misery, by the way. The second trigger lets you repick the modes for each player. Time for the two-way tie for best card when doubled. Pawn of Ulamog and Grim Haruspex. These cards are already ran in about 50% of Judith decks, so is it any wonder why doubling them is the strongest of the synergies presented thus far? Per non-token creature death, you get 2 card draws and or a soul ring's worth of mana that when accessed triggers a good few of the aristocrat payoffs in the deck as well. It's not hard to win with either in play. I hope you don't think that I'm done talking about Judith yet. The eagle-eyed jank lovers among you spotted Vorpal Sword as one of the cards I showed when I was talking about Judith having Death Touch. Yes, I've killed people with it before, and it's fairly easy. With enough treasures and or Eldrazi spawn and Mayhem Devil, you can machine gun down all blockers, then use the floating mana to activate the sword, and bam! Opponent killed. This is about 1 in every 10 games or so, keep in mind, but it does happen. There are also a few cards I considered for the deck that didn't quite make the cut, that I feel the need to bring up in case you want to move in a different direction. First is Torbrand and O'Hare Axanil. Judith, Goblin Bombardment, and Mayhem Devil are all red sources that deal damage. Ultimately, these were cut in consideration for the mana curve, and are better suited for a deck like Garna anyway. Still worth the mention though. Next is Gadrick Crown Scourge. This is kind of like a secondary copy of Mahadi, but ultimately the ratios between sacrifice outlet, fodder, and payoff demanded that one be left behind. And this was the one that was the worst in my opinion. The non-token aspect of this card makes a huge difference, though this is the one decision I could see going back on and adding to the deck. The last card I need to mention is Bringer of the Last Gift. This looks out of left field, as it is just worse than Living Death and Geistcatcher, but I mentioned before, I regularly activate Vorpal Sword. The deck is no stranger to having access to large sums of mana. Ultimately, 3 board looping effects was the number I felt happiest with, but this one is definitely not impossible to run. And there you have it. Hopefully, even if you don't like aristocrat decks, you still found some enjoyment hearing about the deck. And if you're a sacrifice lover, I hope you found some cool tech here that you can bring over to your deck. Maybe this video made you consider playing Judith yourself. If you're curious about other cards I run in the deck that I didn't mention in this video, there's a link to the Moxfield list down in the description below with a primer. Before I end this video, I wanted to ask, was there ever any card that when spoiled, completely revitalized your interest for a deck? Let me know down in the comments below in addition to your thoughts on Judith. Thanks for watching, and until next time, bye!